I'm getting some.
Can I ask you something?
Yep.
Yeah, so the person...
Hold on one second.
The person seems to be also fully occupied.
Yeah, my colleague's in one of the other rooms at the
So
moment.
they're all full now.
Hold on, Dave. Hold on.
And I was wondering whether we can guide stream into the canteen.
Not on the reflecting screen because we don't control it. Comms team do.
That's why I was sending an email to you guys and when I saw that the reply there.
Hold on, Dave. Hold on. I can't hear you. Hold
So
on.
I should have been talking to someone.
The comms team do, but the thing is, there was an actual issue with it over the last week, which we've only just resolved. So it would have been a bit too short.
Okay, thank you.
It's quite a picture of an Asian, but like this. Yes, I'm going to picture
And I'm watching it from the live stream, I'm not watching it from the If that's the case, try the YouTube. Check the levels because the sound is pretty much on max and people are talking constantly. Oh, check the Windows levels as well as the touch panel because the Extron scaler sometimes turns down.
I got this kind of feeling like when we move back. It's just like I don't much friends and doesn't realize they have
Should have brought the longer. It's stretching as my laptop screen. The air has undergone flooding on the side. I think one of the staff is coming over to do that. I don't know if he has or not. Shit, two down, two more to go. That's a fucking, it's a good thing I did. It's a good thing I did.
I think
Bacon in here. There's bacon in here.
Basically, that was like years ago.
Who do? They do. How is the sound sounding? Is it sounding clear?
Maybe that they had it for, I would think so.
Because I don't even remember what mic was set up. It's the built-in one.
Yeah.
Well, I've actually got it set up so that when they start talking on the Alexa mic or it cuts out the room noise. It will only go through the microphones, but since I can't test that, I can't test that until what after that? Is it LJ1 and 2 both packed?
Yes, I've still got like his only spent business 2 years master's the other, so I've still got like 1 year.
Alright, do you want me to go and tell them? LGO2. Hold on one second. where I'm standing now, no, where I'm 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. There's 6 o'clock. There's 29 people standing or sitting on the floor in here. Well, they're not, like, a lot of them aren't going to move. A lot of them have already asked me. I've told them there's other rooms and they don't want to do it. It's just a good thing it stays on. There's already 70 people watching as well. So, Dane, minus the 5 streams you've got, we've already got 203 online. Do you know what they should do next year? You know what they might as well do next year? Great Hall. Yeah, is that anything? This would have been a perfect day for Angus to be involved in it. But he's actually sitting in the room watching, so he can see for himself. No, he's got a seat in there, that's what I'm saying. He managed to get a seat before the madness. Oh, shit. They're having problems with the radio, Mike. I guarantee you something. Let me try to see what the radio happens. I can tell from up here that it's not so well. Angus, test it.
Yeah.
No.
We're actually not starting right this second, so y'all can still keep talking.
Cool, yeah, audio. Did you hear it when she was speaking? Did you hear it when the person at the podium was speaking? Red button. Bottom of it. Red button. Red button.
Mark Fisher Memorial Lecture here at Goldsmith. It's been 2 years since we lost Mark, and I think I can speak for everyone in the department when I say that the pain is still there. The Memorial Lecture is an annual event, and it was inaugurated by Eschon last year. Each year, we will invite speakers to engage with the themes and ideas written about by Mark, with an eye to taking them further and indeed somewhere else. As a means to continue to listen to Mark, which the Memorial Lecture aims to facilitate, alongside a range of other events such as the Fisher Function in 2017, various 4K punk events, reading groups and collective listening sessions that took place over the last 2 years. To continue to listen to Mark indeed means turning to different forms of social, often informal gatherings, and address questions of solidarity and collective politics, to invoke a commitment to modes of being together differently. To continue to listen to Mark also means to listen to the people he was thinking with and talking to. And Jodie Dean most certainly is one of them. Her work, such as Communicative Capitalism, which we read together in a co-taught class Beyond Boundaries, influences writing and thinking. So following Kojo Eshon's powerful and thought-provoking lecture last year, we couldn't think of anyone a better person than Jodie Dean to give the second lecture.
Hello, my name's Mona Munir. I'm the Welfare and Diversity Officer in the Students' Union, and this is Rachel Wilson. So before we move on to the lecture, we would like to address two activities that are very much continuations of Mark's work. The first of which is the Gold Paper Mental Health Working Group. We're a group of staff and students, and we meet every Thursday from 12 to 2 p.m. in the venue in the top floor of the Students' Union building. Our group email is mh@goldpaper.org. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Gold Paper, it is a process that began in 2015 in critical response for the government's Green Paper on Education. Just some of the important steps in the process have been the holding of a People's Tribunal at Goldsmiths in December 2015, a first iteration of the Gold Paper written by Natalie Fenton and published in 2016, a Gold Paper petition launched in March 2017, very much under the impression of Mark's suicide, and signed by over 1,000 people in just 1 week. These regular Gold Paper meetings have taken place since March 2018 in working groups organized around three central demands: a democratization of college governance, housing justice, and mental health.
Mark was involved in the early stages of the Gold Paper process, and his words are quoted in the most recent edition, which was published in September last year, and they summarize well why the process persists. How can lecturers support stressed students when we too are so overstressed? Ever since 2010, a wave of panic has spread through higher education. In place of management, there have been a series of frantic gestures, mechanical reflexes, threatening postures. The message arising from the frenzy has been clear and unrelenting. Work harder, work longer, do more administration, more marketing, or you won't have a job anymore. Teaching and learning are the last things on lecturers' minds, as we are required to become hawksters and hucksters, plugging the gaps in funding. The position is plain. Reading and thinking are luxuries that universities cannot afford anymore. But if we don't have time to think, who does? Everyone bends under the pressure, some crack fatally. The Mental Health Working Group is presently working towards the clarification of demands for an inquiry into the mental health crisis. This inquiry that is something that has already begun in the Gold Paper meetings. It involves a process of collecting testimonies that is committed to looking into the causes of mental health issues and, to quote Mark, the privatization of stress. Testimonies addressing a range of issues, from the provision of mental health services at universities to regimes of extenuating circumstances and the evidences required to prove psychic distress, and an investigation into the ways in which different groups in the university are affected in different ways. These demands will be published and we will begin campaigning around them. The second activity, which continues Mark's work, is happening tonight after the lecture, and Natasha can tell you more.
So, hi, yeah. So, over the last year, erupting in the same moment as the inaugural memorial lecture, myself and other students have been organizing the FK Punk Nights, encompassing workshops, performances, live music, and DJs as a way of celebrating and thinking with Mark. Simon Reynolds acknowledged that Mark's music writing influenced a generation. FK Punk reaches out to admirers, students, and colleagues of Mark's. We're here to help fill the silence left in the wake of his death. We desire to continue this joyful process of bringing people together, to discuss, to dance, to sweat, to sing, and to listen together. I want to thank my co-organizers for making all of this possible: Rachel Wilson, Gilia Ronkina, Stephen James, Kitty Mackay, and Matt Cahoon. And to all the incredible artists who've been part of these events over the last year, whose names are on screen, and to all who have attended each of these events. And to tonight's extraordinarily exciting lineup, with DJ sets from Mikola, Klein, Iconica, Kovco, and Proteus, and live audio-visual work by Archie Smith and Olivier Julian. Tonight's event runs from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., possibly running into the after hours, at Ormside Projects, 32 Ormside Street, Penarth Centre. The nearest bus stop is Old Kent Road, Ilderton Road, but please note that the venue does have a very limited capacity, and we thank you in advance for showing respect to the security and staff. And to introduce Jody. Okay. In a review for Ghosts of My Life, Jody Dean comments that no one writes as achingly well about our slow death by capitalism as Mark Fisher. Like the best of popular culture, he makes depression seductive. We find ourselves lost in a liberating hopelessness. Yet he turns this very liberation into a grimace of possibility, of a desire that exceeds the melancholia of left acquiescence to capitalist realism. In their interview, We Can't Afford to Be Realists, in which they discuss the concept of capitalist realism, Jody Dean speaks to how a term, name, concept, and discourse can provide a momentary and provisional shape that can orient thinking and galvanize action. Jody and Mark enjoyed much dialogue about how instead seeking surges of enthusiasm towards the collective need to invent the future. So, as we continue to grapple with the lost futures left in Mark's absence, Jody Dean will speak to a horizon that inflected much of his later focus around post-capitalist desires and acid communism. Jody Dean is Professor of Political Science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and author of numerous books, including Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies, The Communist Horizon, and Crowds and Party. So please join me in welcoming Jody Dean for the 2019 Mark Fisher Memorial Lecture, Capitalism is the End of the World.
Test, test, test.
So now is it working? And now is it working? It must be the mic.
Test, 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 test.
Now we're going. And what about this time? Yeah? Yay! So a special thanks to the whole tech crew who just got this working. But really, thank you to Visual Cultures and to Henriette for inviting me. And like all of you, I loved, admired, and learned from Mark Fisher. And there is more and too much to say here. So I hope you will recognize and understand my choice to take refuge in the form of the academic lecture, because it's the only way I could actually imagine getting through this. Many of us associate Fredric Jameson's remark, "It's easier to imagine an end of the world than an end to capitalism," with Mark Fisher. For good reason. Mark's account of capitalist realism confronts us with capitalism's unbearable yet unavoidable horrors. From the genocidal destruction of settler colonialism, through the demolition of cultures and modes of life that accompanies commodity production and exchange, to planet-altering anthropogenic climate change, capital subsumes the world. We can easily imagine the end to the world because under capitalism, most of us confront it every day, in ways conscious and unconscious, as we are forced to choose our exploitation, dispossession, and confinement. It's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism, because capitalism for most of us is the end of the world. We witness and endure it in the ruins of everyday life, lost lives, lives of loss. In the US, life expectancy has declined 2 years in a row, in large part because of diseases of despair, addiction, overdose, suicide. In the UK, the percentage of people in the lowest income bracket who have to deal with mental illness is nearly double the percentage of those in the highest income bracket who confront mental illness. In both the US and the UK, as inequality increases, so does depression, anxiety, and physical decline, the casualties of capitalism, as Mark tells us in Capitalist Realism. And as we've seen in the past few decades of suicide reports from Greece, Italy, and India, to mention but a few places, the ravages of capitalism, foreclosure, job loss, debt, the unbearable stress of competing for less, these are deadly, world-ending casualties of capitalism, losses in the class war. Thinking with Mark, I want to salvage possibilities of communist desire from the ruins of capitalism. I'll start by talking about capitalist realism, drawing out its key features. I'll then use Mark's essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, to introduce the themes of comradeship and solidarity, understanding both as indispensable to any contemporary return to communism, that is, indispensable to the possibility of a communist world that we can and will build together out of capitalism's products and remainders. This will then let me consider the loss of comradeship and what regaining it may enable, and I'll explore that via Doris Lessing's 1962 novel, The Golden Notebook. So that's the sketch of the talk tonight. So first, capitalist realism. As y'all, many of you probably know, Marx's idea of capitalist realism, which I think is actually his most important theoretical contribution, it has 4 basic features. First, capitalist realism is a response to the inability to imagine an alternative to capitalism. It's the name for what Marx calls reflective impotence. So capitalist realism is a response, right? It's a response to the absence of another horizon, a response to the loss of communism as the horizon of our politics. So Marx specifies that capitalist realism is not simply the sense that there's no alternative to capitalism. Rather, it's a response to that sense, a reaction to that loss of a sense of possibility. As Marx says in a discussion with Jeremy Gilbert in New Formations, capitalist realism is a resignation or fatalism. Whether we like it or not, things won't be different. It's like it doesn't matter what we do or whether we do anything at all. Capitalism is all there is, and it's here to stay. Something we should notice about this argument, it's post-legitimation. That is, Marx is emphasizing that it doesn't matter whether people think capitalism is a good or just or efficient system. He says, quote, "The operations of capital do not depend on any sort of subjectively assumed belief. What matters now is that we can't imagine anything else." Capitalist realism thus designates this unbearable stuckness in an unbearable system that we can't imagine getting beyond. Again, what Marx rightly calls reflective impotence. Second characteristic, capitalist realism is a pathology of the left. Capitalist realism is left acquiescence, left acceptance of defeat, the left giving up and giving in. Marx emphasizes that, quote, "It is the left which has had to tell itself the story that there's no point struggling for an alternative to capitalism," end quote. I would add that this tends to be accompanied by left concession to anti-communism, typically via the names Stalin and Mao. A concession that says that the lesson of the 20th century is that anything other than capitalism is death. That capitalism is itself death, is denied, displaced, ignored, or, and we go back to the first point, it doesn't matter that capitalism is death because we can't imagine anything else. This concession to anti-communism may or may not be fully conscious. It's present, though, in left practice, which leads to the third feature of capitalist realism. Capitalist realism is a matter of what we do. That's our third attribute, a matter of what we do. We lower our expectations. We substitute spectacle for organizing. Marx, drawing from Zizek, highlights the way that capitalist realism isn't a matter of what we think. We may think that capitalism is an awful, exploitative system that damns most of us to selling ourselves to survive in a setting where there are ever fewer buyers, but our actions go along with the game. And not just our economic actions, but our political actions. As Marx says, the form of left activities in the late 90s, early 2000s tended to be the staging of protests rather than political organization. This produced the sense that the anti-capitalist movement consisted of making a series of hysterical demands which it didn't expect to be met, end quote. Think of anti-capitalism here as like a hipster gesture, cynical nihilism in a kind of knowing more radical than thou attitude that emphasizes how capitalism is so bad and holds us so tightly that there's nothing we can do, nothing can be done except maybe theorize the value form. Marx writes, "We could have left-wing convictions and a left-wing self-image, provided these didn't impinge on work in any significant way," end quote. 4, capitalist realism is an effect of the collapse in the belief in collective politics. Now, this fourth aspect of capitalist realism isn't directly stated in the book Capitalist Realism, but it's implied. It's implied in Marx's critique of the privatization of stress. Why are individuals made, quote, to resolve their own psychological distress when it is clearly a widespread problem in capitalist societies? Why do so many young people suffer from anxiety, PTSD, OCD, depression, dissociation? As an aside, my daughter always looks at me like I'm an idiot when I say this, and she's like, "It's capitalism and patriarchy." that capitalist realism is an effect of the collapse of belief in collective politics is also implied in Marx's critique of the, quote, chemico-biologicization of mental illness. This association of suffering with brain chemistry, he tells us, reinforces capital's drive toward atomistic individualization. Finally, it's implied in Marx's critique of the consensual sentimentality of Live Aid that replaced the antagonism of the miners' strike. What's at stake in this replacement is the absence of a collective subject, a subject that demands to be constructed. So, to reiterate, loss of imagination, left pathology, what we do, and loss of belief in collective politics. Marx's concept of capitalist realism names that reflective impotence which overloads a left unable to imagine an end to capitalism, embedding it in pointless activities that sustain its self-entrapment. Once the left has no horizon beyond capitalism, once it has lost its capacity to imagine another future, it no longer believes collective politics matter. So it sinks into individualism, aestheticism, and moralism, gesturing left without hope of getting anywhere at all. Next section. In Exiting the Vampire Castle, Marx extends the capitalist realism argument in three important ways. First, he links the excessive moralism, individualism, and privatization characteristic of capitalist realism to the disavowal of class. The loss of collectivity is the result of the abandonment of the working class, the deflection and preemption of class as a topic, the eclipse of class consciousness as a matter of left politics. In their place, quote, bourgeois modes of subjectivity come to dominate the movement. Liberals, liberal goals, liberal concerns take the place of the left. The underlying vision is of self-oriented individuals, politics as possession, transformation reduced to attitudinal change, and a fixed, naturalized sphere of privilege and oppression. Anchored in a view of identity as the primary vector of politics, political energy shifts away from strategic, organizational, and tactical questions and onto prior attitudinal litmus tests, precluding from the start the collectivity necessary for revolutionary left politics. Second, right, the second point that where Marx extends the argument in Exiting the Vampire Castle, the second point, which is crucial and vital, he writes, and the second point points then, of course, to the reassertion of class. Right? So if the first one, it's the absence is the problem, now he also says, so we have to reassert it. Marx writes, a left that does not have class at its core can only be a liberal pressure group. Class consciousness is always double. It involves a simultaneous knowledge of the way in which class frames and shapes all experience, and a knowledge of the particular position that we occupy in the class structure. It must be remembered that the aim of our struggle is not recognition by the bourgeoisie, nor even the destruction of the bourgeoisie itself. It is the class structure, a structure that wounds everyone, even those who materially profit from it, that must be destroyed. The interest of the working class are the interest of all. The interest of the bourgeoisie are the interest of capital, which are the interest of no one. Our struggle must be towards the construction of a new and surprising world, not the preservation of identities shaped and distorted by capital, end quote. Acknowledging class is acknowledging the dimension of economic situatedness, placement in the social and economic structure by virtue of one's function in capitalist production. The goal, as Marx emphasizes, is smashing this structure. We aren't trying to get it to include or recognize us. We're trying to destroy it. Third, Mark associates the return to class with the reinvigoration of comradeship and solidarity. No one's perfect. We all make mistakes, so how do we work together? How do we hold each other to account in ways that let us go forward? How do we address and change practices of disrespect within the movement? Through comradeship and solidarity. Mark says, we need to learn or relearn how to build comradeship and solidarity instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other. I agree. We have to teach and encourage each other, be patient, encouraging, maybe even forgiving, especially of those who are on our side. If we don't, if we see enemies everywhere, how can we even have a side? There's no other way. If we aren't comrades, we can't fight the long fight. And even if we could, without comrades, there's not a world to win. So the next section. This is the discussion now of Doris Lessing. I call it Let Us Be Comrades. The importance of Mark's emphasis on building comradeship and solidarity is borne out in Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, a 50-year-old novel that testifies to many of the effects Mark will come to associate with capitalist realism. The novel depicts the decline and exodus that spread throughout the communist world in the wake of Khrushchev's revelations regarding the purges, arrests, imprisonments, and executions occurring under Stalin. We might think of the novel as a kind of origin story for our problems in our present, for the loss of a world born from common struggle. My aim is to read Lessing for Mark, that is, to find in Lessing's depiction of the end of comradeship traces of capitalist realism and perhaps elements leading out of it. I'm terrified I'm going to knock all this over. Lessing's picture of the collapse of the symbolic order of mid-century communism is a picture of the end of the world. The end of comradeship is the unraveling of a common language, the unraveling of a shared sense of the meaning of words and their relation to the world. Like Mark, Lessing refuses to privatize mental illness. For her, the dissolution of confidence in the party, that is, in collective struggle with communism as its horizon, this expresses itself as psychosis. The scene she gives us is one of exhaustion, cynicism, hopelessness, and disarray. The best I can hope for when you are not my comrade, when there are no comrades, is a tired old liberalism. Given the psychosis that sets in with the collapse of the party, even this small dream feels impossible, as we see in Poland, Hungary, and parts of Russia today. The novel begins in 1957 with a conversation that introduces the major characters. Anna, the author of one successful novel, whose notebooks constitute the bulk of the novel. Anna's friend Molly, a minor actress, recently returned from a year's travel in Europe. Molly's ex-husband Richard, and their 20-year-old son Tommy. Now, in the novel, Richard is bothered by the fact that Tommy is suffering from a paralysis of the will. Tommy just sits around brooding, right? This is pre-Nintendo. Richard attributes Tommy's malaise to the collapse of the Communist Party. The impact of the past year, Khrushchev's speech, the invasion of Hungary, the Suez Crisis, has been severe. Quote, "It's not an easy time to be a socialist." Richard pushes the point. And now what? Russia's in the doghouse, and what price the comrades now? Most of them having nervous breakdowns or making a lot of money as far as I can make out, end quote. Collapse and capitalism. This captures the sense of many of those who left the party in the wake of Khrushchev's revelations, the non-options available to them in a world thrown into chaos. Collapse and capitalism, our present of anxiety, depression, and despair in the extremes of climate change, inequality, and the worry that we may no longer be able to afford to live. Two sides of the same coin. Under capitalism, someone always makes money off the suffering of others. When he asks what price the comrades now, Richard isn't saying anything Molly and Anna don't know. They have already started to distance themselves from the party and their former comrades. Previously, Molly was always rushing off to organize something full of life and enthusiasm. Now she feels no obligation to continue doing political work. Anna still feels something, a continued tie or connection to those she still thinks of as comrades, yet she, perhaps like us, is exhausted, confused, uncertain, wrapped up in trying to understand the loss of a great dream. Trying to pull it all together, Anna collects newspaper clippings documenting several years of mid-50s international tension and horror. The war in Korea, the detonation of the H-bomb, the anti-communist witch hunt in the US, purges in the Soviet bloc, and so on. The Communist Party is awful, and yet it seems the only barrier to US nuclear aggression. Britain explodes an atomic weapon. The McCarran Act authorizes the US Attorney General to create detention centers for people who might engage in conspiracy or espionage. Mau Mau rise up in Kenya. Communist leaders are hanged in Prague. Defending the Soviet Union at all costs, the party doesn't provide a space for grappling with the truth of the world. Yet without it, the world feels bereft, meaningless, condemned to a facade of liberalism that masks imperialism, authoritarianism, and colonialism. The party holds open a gap of possibility. We aren't doomed to an eternal capitalism, but only negatively. A negation of capitalism, not a positive promise. Tommy, now remember this is Molly and Richard's brooding 20-year-old son, Tommy confronts Anna about her abandonment of her party work. Anna says that middle-aged women can't be expected to hold on to youthful certainties and slogans and battle cries, but she dislikes hearing what she hears coming out of her mouth. I sound like a tired old liberal. Tommy observes that Anna used to live by a philosophy, and he taunts her for referring to the communist myth and demands to know what does she live by now. Anna's reply is positive, hopeful. She describes a world capable of forward movement, a dream kept alive for a new generation of people. Tommy makes it clear that he won't be that generation. He shoots himself. This segment of the book actually ends with the likelihood that he will die before morning. A subsequent section goes back in time to a meeting of Anna's writers' group that happened in 1952. This regress belies the hopeful linearity of Anna's response to Tommy. Life had not gotten better, comrade. In this section, Anna concerns herself with changes in language, conflicting modalities of meaning and tone. Her writers' group unsuccessfully tries to discuss an unreadable pamphlet on linguistics written by Stalin. Anna observes a tone in their conversation that makes her uncomfortable, a tone associated with making excuses. Quote, "Of course, you have to remember their legal traditions are very different from ours," end quote. She recalls that she once caught herself speaking this way and, quote, started to stammer. "I usually don't stammer," end quote. Anna also notes an increasingly familiar mood. Words lose their meaning suddenly. I find myself listening to a sentence, a phrase, a group of words, as if they are in a foreign language. The gap between what they are supposed to mean and what in fact they say seems unbridgeable, end quote. Comrades fail to say what they all know to be true. Stalin's pamphlet is a symptom of a general uneasiness about language. But as comrades, they can no longer speak together. They are caught in a situation where the words they can say are inadequate to what needs to be said. Anna observes that she's prepared to believe that Stalin is mad and a murderer. Nevertheless, she likes, quote, to hear people use that tone of simple, friendly respect for him. Because if that tone were to be thrown aside, something very important would go with it. Paradoxically enough, a faith in the possibilities of democracy, of decency. A dream would be dead, for our time at least, end quote. The tone of respect points to comradeship, to being on the same side. It's not the same as the tone of excuses. For Anna, using the tone of respect when speaking of Stalin isn't a sign that one is a Stalinist. That is to say, it doesn't indicate that one is making excuses for purges and camps. It indicates belief in collective struggle for a better world. And the thing is, even anti-Stalinist skeptics have to admit this much is right. The end of the 20th century socialist experiment destroyed democracy as well. Anna decides to leave the party after she realizes that she can no longer do her party work, which is lecturing on art. Her typical lecture involves a critique of the egotism of bourgeois art. In the middle of a lecture, several months before leaving the party, she began to stammer and couldn't finish. Anna continues, "I have not given any more lectures. I know what that stammer means." Her decision to leave the party is an effect, not a cause, of the dissolution of the connection between words and meaning. In a conversation with a comrade and co-workers, she experiences this loss again. Words lose their meaning. She can hear their voices, but the words, quote, don't mean anything. In the place of words, she sees images, scenes of death, torture, cross-examination, and so on. And these scenes connect not to the words being used, but to the reality they disavow. Images without meaning, a convergence of the imaginary and the real, what Zizek describes as the decline of the symbolic. Now, Tommy, the moody son who shot himself, lives. He lives, but he's blind. So youth continues, unwilling and unable to keep a communist dream alive. But how could it? The sense of the world that communism once provided is crumbling, along with the practices of comradeship that had previously supported it. Tommy becomes a dominating, blind, but all-conscious presence in his mother Molly's house. Molly is trapped, both by him and by a new sense that life has become a matter of getting used to things that are really intolerable. Although slow and careful, like some kind of zombie, Tommy seems happy. Molly describes him as all in one piece for the first time in his life, yet she's horrified by her own words, matching them against the truth of his mutilation. The truth is that, quote, he enjoys it. Tommy no longer has to choose. He no longer has to feel compelled to find a way forward. He can be where he is, fully occupying that place of capitalism and collapse without having to analyze, understand, or see it. It's as if blindness gives Tommy the capacity to force a maternal scene onto Molly, to envelop her into an infantile oneness that makes him complete at the cost of her misery. Now, I should add that Molly and Tommy don't remain intertwined in this kind of infantile dyad. He actually then attaches himself to a stepmother, and then to a wife, and then drifts into an incoherent, formless politics of spontaneous crowds and expressive students. Anna feels herself breaking down. Words mean nothing. This phrase gets repeated multiple times. They are more and more just, quote, a series of meaningless sounds like nursery talk. When Anna writes words down, they dissolve into images that have nothing to do with them. She's afraid. She falls in love with Saul Green, an American socialist boarding in her house. And Saul is himself breaking down. In conversation with Anna, and this, I think this prefigures the world of social media, Saul talks compulsively, saying nothing. Anna writes, I was listening for the word I in what he said. I. I began to feel as if the word I was being shot at me like bullets from a machine gun. This compulsive talking, this I, becomes the mark of Saul's madness. It sometimes carries with it streams of political jargon that Anna can identify by time and tendency. Trotskyist, American, early 1950s, premature anti-Stalinist, 1954. Anna herself becomes sicker and sicker, obsessed with Saul, and spending more time sleeping and dreaming. They begin to call each other comrade, using the word, quote, with an ironical nostalgia born of disbelief and destruction. Saul observes, as I crack up out of that 100% revolutionary, I notice I crack up into aspects of everything I hate. He wants more than anything to return to the happiness of a time where he believed with others that they could change the world. Saul begins again with the compulsive I, like a machine gun ejaculating regularly. Anna writes, I was listening and not listening, as if to a speech I had written someone else was delivering. Yes, that was me, that was everyone. The I am going to, I won't be, I shall, I want, I. At one point, Saul cries out, my God, what we've lost, what we've lost, what we've lost. How can we ever get back? How can we ever get back to it? How can we get back to it again? Then he switches to the I, as Anna curls up in a sick and drunken ball of pain. Without the party, without communism to provide meaning and structure, Anna has no idea how to understand the world. She experiences herself, quote, as a central point of awareness, being attacked by a million uncoordinated facts. And the central point would disappear if she proved unable to weigh and balance the facts, take them into account, end quote. Of course, her own identity, her individual self, is inadequate to the task of holding a world together. The book ends with Tommy going into business with his father, that is, moving from collapse to capitalism. Tommy embraces the class privilege patriarchy affords. He rationalizes his decision by saying that the world is going to be changed by the efforts of progressive big business and putting pressure on government departments. Of course, we know the other words for this. Neoliberalism, austerity, cuts. Molly gets married. Anna works as a marriage counselor. It's as if Lessing knew Thatcherism was coming. There's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. The loss of the party, of the organizing role of communism in 20th century life, is the loss of a perspective that lets society be seen. Tommy, his generation, can't see the world his mother and Anna saw. Former comrades turn to private life as the space and possibility of politics contracts to ethics and economics. The world that Lessing depicts is the world of the left, not just after 1956, but also after 1968 and 1989. It's our world that seems too exhausted even for tired old liberalism. The end of comradeship is the end of the world, non-meaning, incoherence, madness, and the pointless, disorienting insistence on the I. The problems facing the world can only be addressed through communism, as comrades. The class struggle today is the fight for a future. Capitalism is inadequate to the challenge of climate change and the resulting migrations and struggles over resources. All it can offer is inequality, militarism, walls, and genocide. At the same time, comradeship is not risk-free. It's not a magical solution to all problems facing the left, much less the world. But it is the only form through which these problems might be solved. Anything less dooms us to the competition, individualism, cynicism, and melancholia into which we've descended. Conclusion. Now, to confess, I kind of hate this like super dreary point I've come to, and I expect that Mark would too. Recall, he praised Russell Brand for making communism something cool, sexy, and proletarian instead of a finger-wagging sermon. Mark writes, Brand makes people feel good about themselves, whereas the moralizing left specializes in making people feel bad and is not happy until their heads are bent in guilt and self-loathing. I expect that I've not made anyone here feel good about themselves. I'm not even sure how to go about that. But I want to close by saying a bit more about how comradeship, or the figure of the comrade, might provide a way that we can help each other feel better and be better in common struggle. Right? Like Marx said, we must relearn to build comradeship and solidarity. The comrade gives form to the political relation between those on the same side. It's a generic, abstract figure of political belonging that promises alienation and fulfillment. liberation from the constraints of racist patriarchal capitalism, and a new relation born of collective political work toward an emancipatory, egalitarian future. Exceeding a sense of politics as individual conviction and choice, Comrade points to expectations of solidarity as indispensable to political action. When we do things because of our comrades, when we do things out of comradeship, we show up to meetings we would miss. We do political work we would avoid. We try to live up to our responsibilities to one another. We experience the joy of committed struggle, of learning through practice. We overcome the fears that might overwhelm us had we no choice but to confront them alone. My comrades make me better, stronger than I could ever be on my own. Consider how odd it is to use comrade as a self-description. I am a comrade. Comrade points immediately to another, not myself, to someone who stands with me in common struggle. It forces the acknowledgement of political belonging. I have a comrade. The comrade is the zero level of communism because it changes our relation to ourselves, to each other, and the world. It thereby marks a political relation beyond the friend-enemy binary, calling attention to the effects of being on a side, the effects of that being on those who are on it. It calls attention to how shared commitment works back on those who share it, enabling them to generate new capacities and effects. It draws out the way that partisan parts are always more than their sum, right? The sum always works back on them. Now, some on the left are really skeptical of this kind of political belonging. Seeing comradely discipline only as constraint, rather than as a decision to build collective capacity, they substitute the fantasy that politics can be individual for the actuality of political struggle and movement. This substitution evades the fact that comradeship is a choice. It also ignores the liberating quality of discipline. When we have comrades, we are freed from obligations to be and know and do everything. There's a larger collective with a line, a program, a set of tasks and goals. Right? We're freed from impulses like those enjoined by communicative capitalism to criticize and comment on the outrage of the moment. We're freed from the cynicism that parades as maturity because of the practical optimism that faithful, comradely work engenders. Discipline provides the support that frees us to make mistakes, learn, and grow. When we err, and each of us will, our comrades will be there to catch us, dust us off, and set us right. We aren't abandoned to go it alone. I wonder how many we've lost because of our failure to treat them as comrades. Disorganized leftists too often remain entranced by the illusion of everyday people spontaneously creating new forms of life that will usher in a glorious future. This illusion fails to acknowledge the deprivations and decapacitations that 40 years of neoliberalism have inflicted. If it were true that austerity, debt, the collapse of institutional infrastructures and capital flight, if it were true that these enabled the spontaneous emergence of egalitarian forms of life, we would not see the enormous economic inequalities, intensifications of racialized violence, declines in life expectancy, slow death, youth anxiety, depression, and despair, undrinkable water, contaminated soil, militarized policing and surveillance, and the desolate urban and suburban neighborhoods that are now commonplace. Exhaustion of resources includes the exhaustion of human resources. Lots of times people want to do something, but they don't know what to do or how to do it. They may be isolated in non-unionized workplaces, overburdened by multiple flex time positions, stretched thin caring for friends and family. And I should add here the crucial work of the IWGB union with that's doing work right now with low-pay workers, like the campaign to bring here at Goldsmiths to bring security work in-house. And I think you can learn more at the Precarious Workers Bulletin, which they may have out front, or they may be distributing here. But I was asked to make this plug, so I want to make sure that I get that in there. Disciplined organization. The discipline of comrades committed to common struggle for an emancipatory egalitarian future is necessary. Sometimes we want and need someone to tell us what to do because we're too tired and overextended to figure it out for ourselves. Sometimes when we are given a task, we feel like our small efforts have larger meaning and purpose, maybe even world historical significance in the age-old fight of the people against oppression. Sometimes just knowing that we have comrades who share our commitments, our joys, and our efforts to learn from defeats makes political work possible where it wasn't before. Now, some leftists will agree with everything I've said and then add but. But won't we end up disappointed and betrayed? Won't it all ultimately fail, as it has so many times? What about the harms comrades have inflicted on each other in the name of comradeship? What about the persistence of sexism and racism, bigotry and bias? And what happens when we're no longer on the same side, when we cannot say we or acknowledge a side? Frankly speaking, the critical tendency to reject an idea because of a slew of possible failures is widespread in left milieus. An intellectual facade masks a failure of political will that would be unconvincing in any other context. Right? But this, it's a really strange sort of predetermination of failure that we would never buy anywhere else. You would never say, oh, don't meet that person for coffee in case you fall in love and later have an expensive and hateful divorce. Don't speak up in the meeting in case you lose your train of thought and end up sounding stupid. Don't take up sport or exercise because you might get injured and you'll never be very good at it anyway. Don't live because you'll inevitably die. Worries about the end foreclose possibilities of beginning. Relationships end. Failures happen. But failure is nothing to fear. It's something to learn from, a next step. We lose our comrades. But the fact of an end should not forestall beginning.
Yeah, we can share. We have to share with a lot of people, I think. So we asked, thank you for this really wonderful talk, thought-provoking. I think there's a lot of to discuss. We asked Jody whether she would be opening up for discussions, and she agreed. And I know that Natasha had a first question. Do you want to ask that, or shall we open? I think you want to ask it.
We can open it up if you want. So, I mean, something that was kind of interesting when the lecture was announced was sort of the response that it got publicly as well. So it's like there were comments sort of equating kind of like communism and anarchism with sort of like something pathological. And yeah, and it's kind of like there's something about the way in which this fear of something like a communist horizon incites this kind of very visceral reaction in people, and just kind of like, yeah, like what is happening there? And I feel like it relates a lot to your talk.
So I'm not sure I completely understand. So you mean like some people think that communism is bad, right? If that's the case, then those would be usually capitalist and liberals. And in another language, we would call them the bourgeoisie, and recognize that our goal is to smash the system that gives them their power. So, I mean, it seems strange to give credence to positions that...
Okay, this will be really a lot of back and forth. Maybe I just want to follow up because in your book, no, in the conversation you had with Mark, I think it was called "We Can't Afford to Be Realists." You kind of have this opening conversation in terms of like either to use new concepts. I think Mark was proposing post-capitalism, and you were like, no, communism, basically. And so this insistence in your work and also tonight, basically to not reinvent a new term really, but like put new meanings into it instead of moving to the next concept that we can then fill and then fail basically again.
So let me, if I've understood correctly, so the alternative, and this I think was where Mark was going in that discussion we had, is he was suggesting we need new terms. I don't think so. I actually think that, first of all, this idea that we have to have new terms, to my mind, it fits within a branding, kind of capitalist, kind of marketing, like social, political, entrepreneurial sorts of attitudes, and I reject that. I don't think, like, looking for something new all the time, why reinvent the wheel, right? So you have extra special wheel. No, right? We have a term for a world, an emancipatory egalitarian world where production is based on the needs of people, and that's communism. And it's in a way that we show solidarity with centuries of political struggle in the name of communism on behalf of an egalitarian world. We have to fight that fight. And if we don't use that name, that's not what we're fighting for. So if people want to have another name, then I guess they're not fighting for the same thing.
Okay, now there are questions. Okay, that's it. Okay. Did you get it? We had 4 and now we are reduced to 1 quickly.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I guess my question kind of actually follows on just from that point. The first is just a comment, which is there does seem to be a tension in Mark Fisher's work between the critique of neo-anarchism and the kind of ultra-globalization left, and then the turn to what could come afterwards. And what's interesting about this quote that you've got up on the board is that part of what Mark Fisher was saying about neo-anarchism was that forms of comradeship and solidarity can do capital's work for it, and actually can do capital's work for it. There can be forms of comradeship and solidarity, trade unions for example, which have done capital's work for it, so that comradeship is not, as you say, a kind of magic solution, and there is a sense of kind of losing the political content to that question. And I think it's interesting with the Doris Lessing that these people after 1956 who realized that Stalinism was not communism. Obviously there were critiques from the left of Stalinism after, say, 1924, predominantly Trotskyism. And it does sound like a lot of what you're saying are the kind of arguments you would hear from Trotskyists who try and kind of get you to join their micro-party. And obviously you think that there needs to be some kind of mass party, but all of the kind of things you're talking about, there was a critique of Stalinism that still held on to the goal of communism. Why did it fail? Why did that kind of path not come about? And it seems that what's happened to everyone on the left now, whether you were a Trotskyist or an anarchist or a kind of post-structuralist identity politics person, is that you've joined the Labour Party. And would you consider that to be a form of what Mark would call deflationary consciousness? Are we actually, in this moment of an apparent upsurge, lowering our horizons?
I appreciate the question, thanks. But let me, I don't want to answer it like via Mark, because I don't know what he would say. So I'll give you, say what I think. And I think my basic thing is, I don't think it's all or nothing, right? So, for example, I don't think that one has to say that supporting the Labour Party right here, right now, is a deflationary move, because I think you can also still be involved in more militant struggle at the same time. Right? It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I think that if we can recognize that would be an advance than to thinking that our politics is always pure and always only in one direction and for one thing. So that would be my first pass. Right? I think right now in basically in Europe, or where y'all may or may not be, that the Labour Party is playing a really important role as the strongest left party in Europe, and that it's worth supporting. But it doesn't mean in any way, I think, lessening a critique of capitalism. Right? I mean, it's supporting a party for what it's doing here and now, but that shouldn't deflect from other more radical politics. On Trotskyism, my son's a Trotskyist, so I've got to be careful here. Fight Back. I don't know if it's an IMT party. It's based in. He's in Canada. I don't really. I mean, I think it's really important that there have been small parties carrying on a struggle in an organized way, even under the years of during the years of defeat. I mean, that's important work. That's kept, it's kept hope alive. It's kept a Marxist tradition alive. It's kept real practical knowledge of organizing marches and rallies alive. It's given people real experience and confidence, and that we need to appreciate those. Appreciate that work rather than denigrate it. I think we spend too much time trying to say, oh, this is the bad thing to do, that's a bad thing to do, rather than, oh, here's a group that I want to put my energy in and support. Like, why not look at it more that way rather than trying to be critical of these other ones? Any single political group, institution, party, state, organization we will name will have a million problems. That's politics, right? We don't get the politics we want, ever. Right? It's not that realm, right? We're forced into it in ways so we get the ones that we're in, and then we can work our best to make them better.
I
don't know where I keep it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just had a question about, I'm going to say evangelizing rather than radicalizing, because that's quite a loaded word, but talking to other people about communism, that always seems to be this fear that exists even in working class people of communism, and I would say it's because the interests of capitalists have been internalized by the people they hurt through media, etc., etc. Communism is seen to be inherently offensive because it does threaten personal interest. The idea of putting your energy into the group rather than yourself is inherently a human reaction, and I think you need a lot of hope and a lot of faith in the group to engage with it. How do we do that, and how do we overcome this fear that most people have of communism?
So let's first talk about first, I don't think that it's automatic that people naturally are fearful of groups, right? Like that, it just, I mean, lots of times people like groups. This is a pretty big group. I don't see anybody like freaking out. And, people like are in lots of times different kinds of association that don't bother them. I think it's a bourgeois, capitalist, realist assumption that, oh my God, I've got to protect myself first and anything else is awful, right? I think we've got to break that down and start to realizing that, in fact, there's no special self that's ever going to be fully protected, right? We come embedded with others, imbricated with others. We are social beings. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is to be better in our groups, right? To be comrades, to act with solidarity, right? Our groups shouldn't be toxic. Some people have had bad experiences because the groups have been shitty. And so then, but if people leave them, then we end up fragmented, isolated, alone, with no political capacity whatsoever. So if we're going to have political capacity, we have to be better. I mean, I know that sounds sort of simple, but in practice, it's the challenge, right? We have to learn to build solidarity and comradeship.
So we've got a lot of people who didn't make it into this room. We have 3 overspill lecture rooms full, basically 5 by now. Yeah, it's amazing. It's really amazing. And so we get questions from those rooms as well, and Ramon will pose 1 or 2.
Should we also pool maybe questions, because so people can add like 3 or 4, so people don't have to hear me go on and on every time?
Hi, I have a question from Sam in Professor Stewart Hall Building, room 302. And
so we know where to find him.
Know where to find him.
Okay, everybody, if we don't like this, let's go get him. Come on.
Jody's coming for you, Sam. Sam asks, how do you build comradeship when our subjectivities are capitalist?
Do you want an
Let's take a
additional?
seat,
Is there another question here in this room? Yeah, up there. Okay, I'm moving now.
Hey, I guess this is somewhat related. I'd just like to ask about like this notion of abstraction, and so I'm guessing that there's this kind of left tradition which I guess would fall under the term you used, like disorganized left, where they really, these people, they were really focused on this question of abstraction and emancipation, right? And it seems to me that if you're talking about that leads to quite a negative view of emancipation, right? And Mark Fisher and you talk a lot about needing a positive new vision, which seems to me obviously needs to involve some tackling with abstraction in some way. So I link to subjectivity and abstraction and its role in emancipation.
Okay. I'll take. Want me to go ahead and I'll take these 2 questions, or do you want to get a third? Is it is third that's really on this point? Okay. So, I mean, first, under capitalism, we're all not subjectified and situated the same way, right? So it's not like everybody has the exact same kind of subjectivity under capitalism. We know that we are, there are workers and there are capitalists, and there are some of us who have to sell our labor to survive, and we know that capitalism also relies on giving us particular versions of what it is to be a raced and a gendered person, and gives us a particular range of those things. So it's not like we start from one flat set of capitalist subjectivities. It's already a nuanced, fraught, and divisive kinds of set of subjectivities that we have. So the fact that there are divisions actually is a really good starting point. The fact that our subjectivities themselves are divided is a good starting point. So we build first from the gap, we build from the division, we build from the antagonism, from the conflict. And then we start opening up that side of conflict so that people start to see, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be, the world doesn't have to be that way that it is. So that's why I think would be one starting point for how you build comradeship under, or how to think about comradeship when subjectivities are capitalist. And so my answer is like, they're not fully capitalist even as they're produced under capitalism. That's the way I want to go with that. On abstraction, so yeah, I'm defending abstraction with this, and I'm defending abstraction with the figure of the comrade as to say, look, we can have political relations with each other without having to be deeply imbricated in every nuance of that another person's life. Like, we can do political work together without having to know everything about what someone wants to do sexually, and are they vegan, and these various things, right? There are lots of things that these are important things, but they don't have to be important for every kind of political work. So if I'm with a group making a banner, right, there are things that are relevant to the banner making that aren't the same as relevant to, who's sleeping with whom later on. So I think that the abstraction of comradeship is really, really important, because it says there's a space for anyone here. There's a space for anyone. This is not determined by something that you're bringing from the background, that anyone can be a comrade. So that would be the abstraction there. So abstraction is our friend. Yeah.
Hi. Hang on. Yeah, my question, it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning about terminology, but my issue is not with the word communism. I absolutely agree with the point that anti-Stalinism has led to, what did you call it, capitalist impotence?
I think, yeah, sure.
Yeah, you know, unwilling, you know, unable to recognize that things could be different. And I recognize that, but I don't understand why there has to be a dichotomy between these two things. So, like, is it impossible to imagine a belief in communism without resorting to the rhetoric of Stalinism that turns so many people off by using the word comrade?
So, wait, I don't understand your question. I mean, why are you associating the figure of the comrade with Stalin?
So, as far as I've been able to find, because this is an issue that, for me, that comes up in a lot of left meetings, that Marx never used the word comrade. You know, the word comrade came about through this kind of like 20th century use of communism that kind of went a bit wrong.
Actually, that's not true. Marx uses the word comrade a handful of times. And in case y'all are wondering, there's a book on this coming out. It'll be out from my book on the comrade. It's called Comrade, an essay on political belonging. Will be out from Verso early in the fall. So maybe I shouldn't answer the question. So, no marketing here. Oh my God, this undercuts the question, how do you build comradeship when all subjectivities are capitalist? Oops. Okay, but actually more seriously, the term comrade actually starts to become really lively in socialist groupings at the end of the 19th century. So it was big in the United States. There was a journal called The Comrade. It was an illustrated journal. There was a set of poems by Walt Whitman that extolled the comrade as this kind of romantic figure. It gets picked up in British socialism. I don't remember, 1896, around in there. And Marx uses, even in, I guess it's in one of his letters where he's talking about the Paris Commune, and he talks about the achievements of our glorious party comrades in Paris. So he uses the term. It's not just, and there's, militants all over the world have used comrade. Anarchists use comrade, and it has nothing to do with Stalin. So I think that one thing is just important historically to not let one name start to colonize a whole set of traditions of left belonging. I don't get to decide. So. No,
yeah, but we've got.
Hi, I have two questions. The first question is from Visual Culture's lecturer Danvir, who's assisting in one of the Overspo rooms. And Danvir asks, how do we account for the fact that most of the working class globally are from societies which are former colonies or are slave states? And the second question is from Rob in room 305. And Rob asks, as an academic, can you tell us about your own personal experiences of class identity and positive comradeship? And could you share any thoughts on Marx?
I think that the way we can account for the fact that most of the working class today appears from the insights of people where people were formerly enslaved in the colonies lets us know that colonization and slavery were major tools of capital accumulation. It wasn't just, it's not like industrialization happened in the absence of slavery and colonized. Slavery was a constitutive feature of industrialization, and industrialization was constitutively part of the colonial practices. So that's what the working class looks like, right? The working class, this is the working class that produced capital. Marx, I'm pro. I think I could do another plug, but I won't do another advertisement. So what about positive comradeship? I'm in a very small party that I absolutely love for the experiences of comradeship in it, because for example, if there are events called, everyone's expected to do all of the different work, whether or not it's doing security, whether or not it's picking up the trash, whether or not it's getting up on the stage and saying a few words. And there's no glorification of any one of these roles over any others, and there's no kind of argument about it. It's more like, here's the goal for this event, and everyone understands their assignment and does the work and feels really great knowing that we're all there to do that work for that event. And I think that that experience of following is really great. I sometimes wonder, and now on the class position, right? So the academy is, I guess, typically understood as part of the petite bourgeoisie, in that we have some bourgeois attitudes, even though we are not, in fact, employers of capital. And as a professor, I often feel like I'm supposed to somehow know things or be in charge or something like that. And I think a lot of academics, unfortunately, also speak this way, like, well, I'm the academic and I know these things. And so experiencing being a good follower and following and doing all of the work with everyone else is a really good exercise, and it's a really good to not try to be the person who has the answers, but to be the person who is following the instructions to get the task done. So that would be one of the ways I'd try to answer that one. Did I answer all those? Yeah. Okay.
I was just wondering, with comradeship, do you just mean working together, in which case do you not get that in all systems, including capitalism? And also wondering, what would you call everybody else that is not a comrade? And then being a comrade and having a side, doesn't that mean it's hard to work alongside other people for a shared goal that you might not have the same beliefs or be on the same side, or you might not call them comrades, which could be helpful?
How do I speak the language of a capitalist without alienating myself from them, or just sounding like a utopian who's just preoccupied with compassion?
So I think of comrades are those on the same side as a political struggle, and I'm particularly interested in the idea of comradeship as it's unfolded on the left. So I'm primarily communist and socialist, though anarchist come in here sometimes too. So comrade's not just someone that you're getting along with, right? A comrade's someone you're engaged in collective political struggle with towards a common goal. Someone who's not a comrade might just be your friend, right? No, you don't do political work with everyone. Someone who's not your comrade might be your mom, your dad, a family member, right? Not everyone is our comrade, because our political relations are not the only kinds of relations that we have. Someone might be your enemy, right? Someone you're really opposed, and your group is trying to, destroy the other group or bring them down. So your comrade, a non-comrade could be just someone you don't know, a stranger, could be a friend, could be an enemy, could be a relative. And a non-comrade could also be an ally. And so you have your comrades, and then you might have your allies. So let's say that you're in one particular political party that needs to reach some goals, and that these other parties have goals, and that you guys can work on that campaign together. But it doesn't necessarily make you comrades. You don't share the same, you don't have the same horizon, you don't share the same set of basic commitments. So you may work together, but it doesn't make you fully comrades. Does that answer that? Good. I think today that one of the things that's happened in what I call communicative capitalism is that capitalism has encompassed all of our kind of communicative activities, right? So even a kind of a radical text can circulate as a video on YouTube. People can share it or make memes out of it or something like that. Then it in some ways at that point it loses any kind of radical efficacy. But it still has its language, right? Capitalism now is such a large language, and it's so all-encompassing that there's room for lots of other kinds of language, but their efficacy gets absorbed. So in fact, then we can see that capitalism can have utopian languages within it, but they're just like, oh, look, there's how I can get a romance, I can get a utopia, I can get a dystopia, I can, read these poems. They become all these different objects in a consumer marketplace. Part of the challenge, I think, for building communists for us is actually the development of a set of common language, commitment of practices that we would have in comradeship, so that we know we're speaking the same language, so that we don't immediately assume, oh, you must mean this other thing, or so that we don't have, so that we gain a capacity to trust one another in the language and don't assume that people mean it in a negative or a capitalist or something way. But that's part of the task. Does that answer what you're thinking of? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we've got 3 questions here before we move again to the overspill.
Hi. You mentioned with regard to Mark Fisher, and I think in agreement with when you mentioned his article Accessing the Vampire's Castle, that in more recent society there's an experience of the loss of collectivity, a loss of the working class. Firstly, what is this working class that he is referring to? And then also I was thinking of this very question of class, and I was thinking of George Lukács in History and Class Consciousness, I think written in 23 after the Russian Revolution and the failed German Revolution, and he was addressing class there, or like going back to the side, like readdressing class, like not as a pre-existing like category like in society, but as a historical phenomena, so not just like a pre-existing economic thing, which the German left were maybe a bit too relaxed upon, like pre-Nazism, but as a historical category coming out of the French Revolution and like the overthrow of feudal society, with like what is the third estate, everything, and then this like inalienable right of one's labor power coming into crisis in the Industrial Revolution, and so that class is a historical. George Lukács was emphasizing that it was a historical phenomena that had to do with the crisis that came about in the Industrial Revolution, with the crisis of one's labor power. Sorry, I don't know if that makes sense.
I can do it. Okay. So this whole conversation is making me remember of experience that I had in Johannesburg in South Africa, 2016. It was I was participating in this anti-carceral feminism meeting, and then we had a workshop with the title how do we deal with comrades who rape? Who rape? Rape, sorry. My English is not very good. But, and I remember that we spent like 4 hours we were a group of 100 people, and we spent 4 hours trying to find a common response to that, and then we could not find. So I just wanted to ask, how do we frame justice within social movement with this whole idea of comradeship and solidarity that we've been talking about here?
Can you take one more question from here? Jody? Mm-hmm. Yep.
Hi. I'm working at the moment, I came into sort of communism. Well, my family is sort of in the academic side of communism, you know, like the academic Marxism, that kind of thing. But then when I came into political organizational work recently in the last 2 years, I've started working with sort of, I guess you could say traditionally Marxist-Leninist, sort of what people would call Stalinist organizational types of organization. And something I found, I mean, first of all, I've really found that comradeship is real. It's a real thing, and it really makes you feel like a better person. And it really does, you know, allow you to do better work, essentially. But my question really is, like, in our sort of investigations of how to essentially attract members of the working class, attract people to Marxism, attract people to revolutionary politics, we found that it is increasingly difficult to get our message across to liberals. And it's increasingly difficult to get our message across to people who refer to themselves as leftists. And I feel like more and more we're sort of coming to the conclusion that the people who are, you know, more disaffected, the people who are less in power, the people who have less control over sort of bourgeois ideology, the people who are, you know, more disenfranchised by it, are the traditionally right wing. And there's people who, the rank and file of the right wing, I don't mean, you know, Jacob Rees-Mogg or anything, but like, I mean the rank and file of the right wing seem to be people who are more willing and open to discuss anti-establishment, anti-capitalist even ideas. And I'm wondering, like, in the current moment, how do you see, you know, communism as a movement really, you know, moving forward? And would you say that trying to attract and trying to persuade right-wing people of anti-capitalism and to sort of move away from right-wing ideology, how would you say that could become a force within, you know, the contemporary communist movement?
So I understood Marx's account of class in Exiting the Vampire Castle to be a fairly straightforward Marxist understanding of class referring to a person's position in production, and that it involves whether or not one is forced to sell one's labor power in order to survive, and what are the conditions under which that labor power is sold, what are the conditions that enable it to be bought, what are the conditions that give it capacities. I think that that is a historically specific account of class. So I wouldn't find some massive change between Lukács and Fischer. I don't see a difference there, right? You're talking about whether or not people have to sell their labor power. So I don't know if that addresses what you're getting at, but that's the way I see that. On justice and social movement, that's a big and important question. I mean, I feel very fortunate because my party is not conflicted on this question. People can get expelled for sexist and racist and homophobic and transphobic behaviors. So, I mean, rape is of course off the table, and it's disturbing that that's not a kind of obvious thing now. But let me step away from that. Let me just finish. Can I? Think about South Africa. Yeah, I want to finish my point. Right. Right. I understand. And so I want to do another little story that's something different. And this is a story about expulsions. And it's from the biggest show trial that the Communist Party ever had in the United States. And it happens in 1933, where a white Finnish worker is expelled from the party for, so we would say now white supremacy or white supremacism. He was expelled for white chauvinism and not being not carrying out the party's strong emphasis on making sure that black workers were welcome into every aspect of party and social and private life. And so he gets the trial is over. It has 1,000 workers there. A jury is chosen from the workers, and he's expelled. But he's expelled with the idea that he can come back in a year. He's not cut off from the party. He is integrated into an effort to actually, what he has to do is to show that he has understood his mistake and now work extra hard on building connections between black and white workers and selling the Liberator, which was a major paper at the time. So what made this a good answer is that they didn't cut him off. It gave him a road back to the party. It didn't say that you are only and ever this person who acted in a racist way, which might be for our situation with someone who is a rapist. It wouldn't say you are not that identity, you are not now that person completely, but you have been our comrade. Can we find a way to maintain connection with you so that you might be better, so that there's something else that can happen? So I'm not sure, obviously I don't know your specific case you're talking about, but I think this Jokinen trial and decision emphasized that someone can make a mistake and be expelled and not be totally apart from us. We can usher them back, give them a path back into the party. And we need to have those kinds of, any kind of, I think, justice in the movement has to find ways to give people paths back if they're willing to admit their mistake and, and do better. On the attracting people to revolutionary politics, I think that's a really hard and a really contextual question. And And you know, Lenin in Left-Wing Communism says that that we need to organize wherever the workers are, and he says even in the Black Hundreds, which was these horrible, you know, anti-Semitic and racist groups, but it's like that's where the people were. That has not been my own experience, and so I'm not sure about that as as a primary site of a way to spend organizational energy. I would worry that you know, does one start to make other kinds of concessions in order to reach these people? So I don't know, but there can be specific situations where maybe it's useful. I think one way actually to attract people to revolutionary politics is by showing that you're doing the work and make it be something that people want to join, right? Showing that your group has the most energy, that you are the ones that actually are doing exciting things and are welcoming people into it, seems to me like at least one way, rather than kind of targeting, okay, we want to definitely go get these people. That was all three, yeah?
Yeah. Jody, are you okay to take additional questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Oh, you're asking here. Okay. I was like, I hear these voices.
Okay, we have three questions from the Overspill rooms. The first question is from Cleo in room 305. Cleo asks, communism is often seen as a thing of history, and she notes that this is a memorial lecture. The right is weaponizing a vision of the past. Is nostalgia something communism can harness, or should it be fought against? And the second question is from Elliot in LG02. Elliot asks, what is a good basis for trusting the communist project beyond the failures of capitalism and mindless adherence to the economic theory written nearly 2 centuries ago? And then we have a question from T in room 302. T asks, so much of the history of the left's understanding of itself has been about a nostalgia or for solidarity. So it's attached to the other question. But I'm interested in the flip side of this, the conversations that have been ignored or derided because they disrupt romantic ideas of solidarity. Those that left the left or were never included in the first place. I think of Black power groups, Black feminist spaces, queer organizing. These groups built with each other because the left was more concerned with upholding the idea of comradeship than doing the complicated work to be a comrade. Perhaps the collectivity we imagine was never there. There are so many that have had their trust broken or have been failed by left organizing. How can we have comradeship that is really committed to doing better? And then I have one final question. This is from Sep in LGO2. Sep asks, how do we see the potentials of less, I'm sorry, I'm trying to interpret this in technology here, doctrinaire institutional changes. I'm not quite sure what that is, but so we'll just go with institutional changes at this point. So how do we see the potentials of less institutional changes that operate perhaps more on the meta level, but create spaces for collective action and epistemic addressing of catastrophic risk and injustice? For instance, the deliberate democracy through citizens, juries, and assemblies.
Okay, my pen was running out of ink, so yeah, maybe we'll find another one. All right, on the nostalgia, harness or fight. I gotta say, I think that that there's got to be another option. What about like like cautiously harness or something like this, or harness with humor? Like I follow on Instagram. What's it called? Like Soviet visuals or Soviet. What's it called? So. It's gorgeous, like Soviet visuals. It's fantastic, and it's another way of seeing the Soviet Union that I didn't see as a kid in them. And That's not what Americans saw, and they're gorgeous, gorgeous images. That's really great. There's socialist memes that I think are really fun and awesome. Man, I really like the one where like it's a giant kind of Maoist scene with Bernie Sanders in the middle. So I think that this is not just nostalgia. I think it's recognizing a world that saw an alternative to capitalism and was actively fighting for it. And so I think we use that, but we don't get embraced. We don't totally drink it and act like that's the only world we have. We have to, make it part of ours. So that's that one. Good basis for attraction to the communist project. What about the end of exploitation and an emancipatory egalitarian future where production is based on need? That strikes me as a good idea. What about collectively dealing with climate change rather than letting the fossil fuel industry continue in its direction as the very rich seizes all the goods and stores them in offshore locations? I think that this is promising. So I think a good basis of attraction for the communist project is precisely because it says that that the only future way to go forward for the most of us, for the vast majority of the planet, is collectively with production based on need. On the people's conversations ignored or derided, and then associating that with Black power groups, that's not a great reading of communist history. It's really not a reading of communist history in the United States, where the Communist Party was the first interracial group to actively fight against lynch law and Jim Crow and arrange for legal defense for African Americans who were accused, who were up for being lynched, who were accused of rape. This was in the 30s, the famous Scottsboro Boys trials. The Communist Party was the first interracial party in the U.S. to run African American candidates. It provided in the 40s and 50s leadership roles for Black women in the party. So it's simply just not the case to say that all communist parties were excluding Black people. Particularly then if you start looking at communist parties in Africa, right? There were real parties there, right? All of the Third World liberation struggle relied on the work of communist parties and comrades in those parties. So I think one of the ways that we can move forward is by not mapping a very narrow workerist assumption that workers are white industrial workers, that's what a worker is and that's what communists organize, mapping that retroactively onto 60 or 70 years of political struggle that was going on globally. That's what has to happen. I think, in fact, for us to be better is to stop demonizing communists for stuff that communists weren't doing. Right? Communists were some of the most, at least in the United States, most racially progressive people in the country. They were addressing problems in the party. It's not that they weren't. And we should also recognize the Black Panther Party had a strong communist and socialist subtext to it. Like that was some of their major themes. There were other Black militant groups organized as communist and socialist throughout the 1960s in the New Communist movement. And again, that's just using the US example. So I think, and then I think the way we'd be better now is to recognize that as we go forward, we don't lose the lessons of the critiques of racism and homophobia and sexism. We incorporate those, right? We have to incorporate those. And in fact, at least in the Communist Party in the 50s and 60s in the U.S. was doing a lot to try to do it. It didn't always do it successfully. It was also the 1950s and 1960s, but we have to learn from their mistakes and from the things that they were doing right.
Thank you, Jody. Are you up for another round? Yeah. Okay. So what I would suggest, given the time and the energy level, having a last round here, maybe up there. Sorry, and then up, and then also and then give the last round of questions to the Oberspill room. So 2 sets of questions. 3 people up there.
I know.
Sorry.
Hi. So my question is it's about the term capitalism as opposed to communism, because it seems the kind of dichotomy is between the two. But I guess the question is the degree to which capitalism really is just one system, and just an observation that kind of across the West, the government spending kind of as a proportion of GDP is kind of, you know, somewhere above 40% for most countries, and there's a range there. Different countries do it differently and provide different services, and I guess the question is like, what does that mean about our kind of what capitalism is, and also what does that mean for the idea of communism in relation to that, and its historical importance to that as well, I guess.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I've heard some people say that countries like the US and the UK are like largely labour aristocracy, with the exception of prisoners and undocumented migrants, and that the real people we need to be organising with and having solidarity with are like the dudes out in Foxconn making our laptops and stuff. Could you maybe say a little bit about that and like international solidarity?
Thank you. I'm interested in where you situate non-human animals in amongst all of this, considering like kind of a climate change minded communism, and the fact that non-human populations kind of suffer most either through extinction or through the meat industry, and on the flip side of that, how kind of slaughterhouse workers suffer horribly in those sorts of conditions, and should we be kind of fostering comradeship across species lines as well as across like human divisions?
Thank you for your talk. I'm doing research into depression and how its pathology and experience are sort of a function of the subjectivity that comes with the reign of neoliberal rationality, and then becomes individualized through capitalism. And I was wondering how you see this inherent connection between mental illness and capitalism.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to be rude, keep putting my hand up. I just felt that there's something really beautiful that Mark did with his work, that was to describe forms of collectivity that didn't describe themselves politically. And do you think that it's only meaningful if a collective describes itself politically? Because earlier you said something about your true comrades, you don't need to know about their foibles, you don't need to know whether they're vegans or their sex life, but actually there's great collectivity through sex clubs and veganism is probably doing more for the ecology of the planet than, well, in my view, communism. So I just wondered whether you think modes that don't describe themselves in those ways are important.
Is that it? 5, or we have more?
I just really want to continue on what was just mentioned, in terms of what really is considered a collective political action, and whether it has to be, related to a party, or whether like groups like that and such activities can also be considered political and, creating political change. And in terms of the dichotomy between capitalism and communism, isn't that perhaps also a sign of lack of imagination?
Okay, now that's it, right? Okay. So the first question was regarding the position of the state and capitalism, and does the fact that the state is involved mean the systems are not capitalist? I think no, the state's involved to support the systems and make and ensure that they're capitalist. The state, that's why, what is it? Marx calls the state has the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. The role of the state is to protect, secure, and guarantee capitalism. It's never been the case that capitalism was only markets doing their thing with no with no state role, right? Who guarantees things like weights and measures or produces money? In capital, it's so important. The discussion of primitive accumulation is very much an account of the role of state forces in a kind of, as David Harvey says, an accumulation by dispossession. So the role of the fact that the state is present is not an argument against the system being capitalist, because the state is what is guaranteeing and holding up the system of of production for the sake of capital accumulation. Right? That's what the state's doing. International solidarity is absolutely crucial, right? Absolutely. I mean, there should be no assumption anymore if there that somehow communism is a project for one country or is simply a national project. It has to be international. In fact, historically it's been known as international communism. And what that means with respect to solidarity for Foxconn workers, I don't know exactly. I would recommend a wonderful book by Jack Cho, Goodbye I Slave, which is a fantastic account of the conditions of Foxconn workers, and he is part of a working group that I think they're based in Shanghai that does a lot of stuff directly with people in the factories. So that would be a place to start. On non-human animals, at this exact moment I am so grateful to my Russian comrades for making me read Platonov, because Platonov talks about the ways that animals and trees and shrubs are also comrades. And his discussion is a little freaky, but it's also really exciting because it makes you think about a kind of relationship to to non-human others that is not based simply on use, but on a kind of mutuality and a kind of respect. I would say that, of course, it's not the measure isn't though just strictly, it's not a politics that begins with who suffers most, right? I mean, I would want to, and I would say that the conditions of people in factory meat production, their working conditions are terrible, and they're exploited laborers, and they have to be supported, organized as best they can. But we shouldn't say that the only reason is because they suffer more than anyone else. That's not the measure. The measure is exploitation, justice, dignity, fairness, equality. Mental illness and capitalism, I kind of thought that I talked a lot about that, like the first half of the talk. The one thing I will say that's different, I think that we see intensifications around mental illness as life gets more competitive and desperate, and people are supposed to hold it all together by themselves. I think individualism is actually the worst force that makes people mentally ill, because you're supposed to be able to bear everything. You're supposed to be able to adapt to everything. You're supposed to be able to do it all and smile. And this is a horrible, horrible burden, particularly under conditions of climate change and amplified inequality and debt and foreclosure. So capitalism makes money off of people's illness. It probably makes more money off of people's illness than it does off of people who are well these days, because the kind of capitalism that we have does no longer rely on a middle class, but relies on a very small upper class that is concentrating the wealth in its hands and leaving out any kind of middle class. I mean, that's what we've seen over the last 40 years, right? There's no middle class anymore. Right? We have a vast majority of the proletarianized and a top 1% that's taken everything. So I think that we've got to keep that element in mind. Capitalism doesn't need the middle, and that's why also universities are getting cut as well. Number 5, forms of collectivity, they're not political. Oh, sure. That's just not what I'm interested in. Right? I mean, of course, I didn't talk anything about religion in churches. It doesn't mean they don't exist. And it doesn't mean that I don't think that they matter for people and provide things for their lives. But I am trying to get people to think about forms of politics that enable political organizing and struggle against capitalism under conditions of climate change and under conditions that we cannot bear any longer. Other people want to emphasize other things. that's fine. That's just not my project. Okay, so what you're saying is maybe a better organizing strategy is not say, do you want to join a communist party, but say, would you like to participate in this blockade of a fossil fuel company? Right, which I actually think is true. You don't always have to go out with your big guns, like, just you don't always have to have someone to sleep with them the first time you meet them. No, it can help.
Okay, I think...
Okay. Yeah, we've got.
Is it working still? Okay. Jody, thank you so much for the fabulous energy that you brought into this room.
Okay, good.
I think. So there are lots of more questions, follow-up questions, new questions, not only here but also in the overspill rooms. I think we have to let her go and have a drink with us. Speaking of which, so let's continue the conversations over discussions over the over a drink. For once at for K-Punk event for sure from 10 o'clock onwards. In the meantime, if you want a shortcut, basically, we booked the New Cross House upstairs room for 2 hours. It's just down the road. If you don't know where it is, just ask someone or follow the masses. And then on the other, one last note is when you get outside of Ian Gallen Theatre, so this room, you come, you enter, you get to the bookstop, to David's independent bookstore, where all the books from Mark Fisher are on sale tonight. So please visit and say hello, basically. Thank you.